Long before the ice broke beneath her feet, Eleanor Fairmont had been living on the thinnest of surfaces. England, 1810. The January wind cut through the stone walls of Fairmont Manor with a cruelty that matched the season. In the cramped study that served as both morning room and business office, Lady Eleanor Fairmont sat at her father's old mahogany desk, a ledger open before her and ink staining her fingers. At 29, she had long since abandoned the pretense that her life would resemble the lives of other viscountesses' daughters. There were no seasons in London, no wardrobes of silk gowns, no carriage rides through Hyde Park. There was only this: columns of numbers that never quite balanced, creditors who grew less patient with each passing month, and the constant calculation of which necessity could be delayed another week. The Morning Post had brought 3 letters. 2 were from tradesmen demanding payment for goods delivered months ago. The third bore the seal of a solicitor in York, and its contents had sent a chill through Eleanor that had nothing to do with the draughty room. The language was formal, almost polite, but the message was clear. The debts her father had accumulated before his death 3 years prior were larger than she had known, far larger. The bank that held the mortgage on Fairmont Manor was losing patience. There were legal remedies available to creditors. There were consequences for continued delay. Eleanor set the letter aside and pressed her fingers to her temples. She had managed, somehow, for 3 years, selling off pieces of her mother's jewellery when times were particularly dire, negotiating with merchants who remembered her father with fondness, running the small estate with ruthless efficiency, coaxing productivity from land that had been neglected for too long. But there were limits to what ingenuity and determination could accomplish when there was simply no money left to squeeze from stone. "Eleanor?" The voice came from the doorway, soft and worried. Eleanor looked up to find her mother standing there, one hand resting on the doorframe for support. Lady Constance Fairmont had once been a beauty, the belle of her own London season 30 years prior. Now, at 54, she was a shadow of that woman, her frame thin beneath the layers of shawls she wore constantly against the cold. The lung ailment that had plagued her for 2 years had stolen her strength, leaving her breathless after the slightest exertion. "Mamma," Eleanor said, rising quickly, "you should be resting near the fire. It's too cold in this part of the house." "I heard the post arrive," Constance said, moving slowly into the room. Her gaze went to the letters on the desk, then to Eleanor's face. "More bad news?" Eleanor hesitated, then nodded. There was no point in lying. Her mother was frail, yes, but her mind remained sharp. "The solicitors are becoming insistent. The debts are larger than father led me to believe." Constance sank into the chair across from the desk, her breathing shallow. "How much time do we have?" "I don't know," Eleanor admitted. "They didn't specify, but the tone suggests their patience is exhausted." For a moment, neither woman spoke. The fire in the small grate crackled, inadequate against the January chill. Somewhere in the house, Eleanor could hear Mrs. Davies, their sole remaining housekeeper, moving about. Once, Fairmont Manor had employed a staff of 12. Now there were 3. Mrs. Davies, a groundskeeper who came twice a week, and a girl from the village who helped with heavy cleaning. "You should have married Mr. Thornbury when he asked," Constance said finally, her voice gentle. "Or Mr. Wesley, or even Mr. Grant." Eleanor returned to her chair, picking up her pen. "Mr. Thornbury was twice my age and drank himself insensible every evening. Mr. Wesley had 7 children who needed a mother, not a wife. And Mr. Grant made it abundantly clear that his interest was in the Fairmont name, not in me. They would have provided security." "They would have taken me away from you and Oliver," Eleanor said quietly, "and none of them would have helped with our debts. Their own circumstances were hardly better than ours." Constance sighed but didn't argue. They had had this conversation before in various forms over the past several years. Each time Eleanor had turned down a proposal, however unsuitable, Constance had worried, not because she wanted her daughter unhappily married, but because she feared what would happen when she was gone. And Eleanor was left alone, with nothing. The sound of footsteps on the stairs announced the arrival of the 3rd member of their small household. Oliver Fairmont burst into the study with the kind of energy that only a 16-year-old boy could possess, his dark hair windblown and his cheeks reddened from the cold. He was tall for his age, already approaching 6 feet, with their father's broad shoulders and their mother's fine features. In a few years, he would be handsome. In a few years, if Eleanor could manage it, he would be at Oxford. "The fence in the north pasture has come down again," he announced, then stopped when he saw both women's faces. "What's happened?" "Nothing that concerns you," Eleanor said quickly. "Did you check the sheep?" "All accounted for, though they won't stay that way if the fence isn't repaired soon." Oliver moved to warm his hands at the fire, then turned to study his sister. "You're lying. Something's wrong." Eleanor exchanged a glance with her mother. Oliver was no longer a child, though she sometimes wished she could spare him the burden of their circumstances. "More creditor letters," she said finally. "Nothing we haven't managed before. How much do we owe?" "Oliver, I'm not a child, Eleanor. I'm 16. If our home is at risk, I have a right to know." He was right, of course. Eleanor closed the ledger with a soft thump. "More than we can pay with current resources. I'll manage it. I always do. By selling more of Mama's jewellery. By denying yourself every comfort." Oliver's voice rose with frustration. "I should leave school. I could find work in York or even London. I could—" "You will do no such thing," Eleanor said sharply. "Your education is the one investment we can still make in this family's future. When you've finished your studies, when you have opportunities we cannot currently imagine, then you can help. But not before." Oliver looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in Eleanor's expression stopped him. He was a good boy, she thought, a bright boy. He deserved better than this slow slide into genteel poverty. The knock at the front door startled all three of them. Visitors were rare at Fairmont Manor, particularly in winter. They heard Mrs. Davies's footsteps in the hall, the creak of the old door opening, a murmur of voices. Then the housekeeper appeared in the study doorway, her expression uncertain. "Begging your pardon, my lady," she said to Eleanor, though the title felt increasingly hollow. "But there's a gentleman here. Says he has business in the area and thought to pay his respects to the local families. I've shown him to the drawing room." Eleanor frowned. "Did he give a name?" "Visconti Hartley, miss." The name sent an unpleasant chill down Eleanor's spine. Edmund Hartley owned the neighbouring estate, a property 3 times the size of Fairmont Manor. He was a man of 45, twice widowed, with a reputation in the county that made respectable mothers keep their daughters at a safe distance. He had called on Eleanor twice before, both times with proposals that had nothing to do with marriage and everything to do with a different sort of arrangement. "I'll speak with him," Eleanor said, rising. She saw her mother's worried expression and added, "In the drawing room, with the door open. Mrs. Davies, please bring tea." The drawing room was only marginally warmer than the study. Eleanor had ordered a fire lit, but the room was too large and too poorly insulated to ever feel truly comfortable in winter. Visconti Hartley stood near the window, examining a landscape painting that had belonged to Eleanor's grandmother. He turned when she entered, and his smile was all predatory charm. "Lady Eleanor," he said, bowing. "How delightful to see you looking so well." She was not looking well, and they both knew it. Her dress was 3 years out of fashion, carefully mended. Her hands were reddened from work that a lady should never have to do. But she kept her spine straight and her voice cool. "Visconti Hartley, to what do I owe the pleasure of your call? Can a neighbour not call on a neighbour in friendship?" He moved away from the window, close enough that Eleanor could smell the brandy on his breath, though it was barely past noon. "Though I confess, I've been concerned about you and your family. These are difficult times for everyone, but particularly for a woman alone trying to manage an estate. I manage quite well, thank you." "Do you?" His gaze swept the room, taking in the faded curtains, the empty spaces on the walls where paintings had once hung. "I hear your creditors are becoming impatient. I hear the bank is considering its options." Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides, but she kept her voice level. "I wasn't aware my private business was a subject of county gossip." "Everything is a subject of county gossip, my dear, particularly when it concerns a woman as—" He paused, his gaze moving over her in a way that made her skin crawl. As notable as yourself. Mrs. Davies entered with the tea tray, and Eleanor was grateful for the interruption. She poured with steady hands, though she wanted nothing more than to throw the man out of her house. But one did not throw out a Visconti, particularly when one's own position was so precarious. "I'll be direct," Hartley said, accepting his cup but not drinking. "I'm prepared to make you an offer, a generous one. I'm not interested in selling Fairmont Manor. I'm not talking about buying property." He set down the cup and moved closer. "I'm talking about an arrangement, a mutually beneficial relationship. I would settle your debts, provide an income for your mother's care, even fund your brother's education. In return, you would." He let the sentence trail off, but his meaning was abundantly clear. For a moment, Eleanor couldn't breathe. The casual way he proposed it, as though he were discussing the purchase of livestock, made rage rise hot in her throat. "You want me to be your mistress. I want to help you," he said smoothly. "You're a woman of quality, Eleanor. You deserve better than watching your family's legacy crumble around you. I can provide security, comfort. All I ask in return is companionship." "No," Eleanor said. The word came out hard and flat. "The answer is no. It will always be no. I'll ask you to leave now." Hartley's expression hardened. "You're being foolish. Pride won't keep your family fed. Pride won't save this house when the bank comes to claim it. Perhaps not. But I'll face that ruin with my dignity intact." She moved to the door and opened it. "Good day, Visconti." For a moment, she thought he might argue, but then he smiled, a cold expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Very well. But when you find yourself with no other options, Lady Eleanor, remember that I made this offer. Remember that you chose pride over practicality." He left, brushing past her closely enough that she had to step back. Eleanor waited until she heard the front door close, until she heard his horse canter down the drive, before she allowed herself to lean against the doorframe, her hands shaking. "Eleanor!" Her mother appeared in the hallway, Oliver behind her. What did he want? Eleanor straightened, smoothing her skirts. "Nothing of consequence. Mama, you should rest. Oliver, that fence won't repair itself." She returned to the study alone, closing the door behind her. The letters still sat on the desk, mocking her with their formal language and their terrible implications. The ledger still didn't balance. And now there was the memory of Hartley's casual cruelty, his assumption that her desperation would override her self-respect. Eleanor sat down and picked up her pen. There had to be a solution. There was always a solution, if one looked hard enough. She just had to find it before the walls came down around them. The afternoon post brought one more letter. This one bore no solicitor's seal, no creditor's demands. The paper was heavy, expensive, the handwriting elegant. Eleanor broke the seal and read, "The Duke of Northmere requests the pleasure of the company of Lady Constance Fairmont and family at a winter gathering at Northmere Hall on the evening of January 28th. Light refreshments will be served." Eleanor read it twice, certain she had misunderstood. The Duke of Northmere had returned to Yorkshire. She had heard he kept rooms in London, that he rarely visited his country estate. And he was inviting the Fairmonts. They barely qualified as gentry anymore, let alone suitable company for a duke. But the invitation was real, and it was for all of them. Eleanor set it aside and returned to her ledger, but her mind kept drifting back to the heavy cream paper and the elegant script. Perhaps, she thought, there was one solution she hadn't yet considered. Perhaps there were still possibilities in the world beyond the walls of Fairmont Manor. Perhaps there was still hope. The carriage that arrived at Fairmont Manor on the evening of January 28th was borrowed from a distant cousin, and the dress Eleanor wore had belonged to that same cousin 2 seasons prior. The pale green silk had been altered to fit Eleanor's slighter frame, the waist let out and the sleeves adjusted, and if one looked closely, the signs of mending were visible along the hem. But in the dim light of winter evening, Eleanor thought, perhaps no one would notice. Perhaps she could pass for what she had once been, rather than what she had become. Lady Constance had insisted on attending, despite Dr. Porter's warnings that an evening out in the cold might aggravate her condition. She sat across from Eleanor in the carriage now, wrapped in so many shawls that only her face was visible, her breathing shallow but steady. Oliver sat beside their mother, his excitement barely contained. He had borrowed a coat from the same cousin who had provided the carriage, and though it was slightly too large in the shoulders, he wore it with the unconscious confidence of youth. "I still think this is a mistake," Eleanor said quietly as the carriage rolled through the gates of Northmere Hall. "We don't belong here, Mama. The Duke of Northmere doesn't entertain families like ours." "The Duke of Northmere invited us," Constance replied, her voice soft but firm. "And more importantly, Oliver needs to see that there is a world beyond our current struggles. He needs to meet people who might help him when the time comes for Oxford." Eleanor wanted to argue that Oliver's chances of attending Oxford grew slimmer with each passing month, but she held her tongue. Let her mother have this hope. Let Oliver have this evening of normalcy. As for herself, she would endure it with as much grace as she could manage, and perhaps make connections that might prove useful when their situation became truly desperate. Northmere Hall rose before them like something from a dream. 3 stories of honey-coloured stone, tall windows blazing with light, the kind of elegant architecture that spoke of wealth so old it had forgotten its origins. Carriages lined the curved drive, and elegantly dressed guests made their way up the wide front steps. Eleanor's stomach tightened with apprehension. She should not have come. They should not have come. But it was too late to turn back now. A footman in immaculate livery helped them from the carriage. Another took their cloaks. A third directed them toward the drawing room where guests were gathering. Eleanor kept one hand on her mother's elbow, supporting her as they moved slowly up the steps and through doors that opened into a world Eleanor had almost forgotten existed. The entrance hall alone was larger than Fairmont Manor's drawing room. Marble floors gleamed beneath their feet. A massive chandelier cast warm light over walls hung with portraits and landscapes. The murmur of conversation and soft laughter drifted from the open doors ahead, and Eleanor caught glimpses of silk gowns and tailored coats, the glitter of jewels and the shine of polished boots. "Steady," Constance murmured, as though sensing her daughter's urge to flee. "We belong here as much as anyone." They did not, but Eleanor appreciated the lie. The drawing room was magnificent. Tall windows draped in deep blue velvet, furniture upholstered in cream and gold, a fire blazing in a hearth large enough to stand in, and everywhere, people. Easily 40 guests, perhaps more, all of them radiating the particular confidence that came from never having to count the cost of anything. "Lady Constance Fairmont," a butler announced. "Lady Eleanor Fairmont, Mr. Oliver Fairmont." Several heads turned. Eleanor felt the weight of gazes assessing and dismissing them in the space of a heartbeat. The shabby gentility of their clothing, the careful mending, the way Oliver's coat didn't quite fit. She lifted her chin and met those gazes with cool composure, refusing to show the humiliation that burned in her chest. "Lady Constance." A woman approached, her smile warm and seemingly genuine. "How delightful that you could attend. I'm Mrs. Appleby, the housekeeper here. His Grace asked me to ensure you were made comfortable. May I show you to a seat near the fire? The evening is quite cold." Eleanor could have kissed the woman for her kindness. Constance allowed herself to be led to a comfortable chair positioned close to the hearth, and Eleanor saw her mother's shoulders relax slightly as the warmth reached her. Mrs. Appleby brought a footstool, adjusted the cushions, and summoned a footman with tea before melting back into the background. "Stay with Mama," Eleanor told Oliver quietly. "I'll find refreshments." She moved through the room with careful deliberation, keeping to the edges, observing rather than participating. Small clusters of conversation formed and reformed. She recognized some faces from county functions attended years ago before her father's death. Others were strangers, likely guests from London or neighbouring estates. She caught fragments of talk, politics, the weather, the latest scandal involving someone's daughter and an inappropriate suitor. "You look as though you're contemplating escape." The voice came from her left, masculine and tinged with amusement. Eleanor turned to find a man watching her, his expression more curious than mocking. He was perhaps 40, with greying hair and kind eyes, dressed well but not ostentatiously. Merely observing, Eleanor replied. I find people more interesting when they don't know they're being watched. A philosopher, the man said, smiling. How refreshing. I'm Thomas Bennet, secretary to His Grace, and you are Lady Eleanor Fairmont, unless I'm very much mistaken. You're not mistaken. How did you know? His Grace mentioned that he had invited your family, and you have the look of someone who would rather be anywhere else, which suggests you're not here out of social ambition. Bennet gestured to the room at large. Most of these people would sell their grandmothers for an invitation to Northmere Hall, but you look as though you're planning your exit strategy. Eleanor couldn't help but smile. Is it that obvious? Only to someone who feels the same way about these gatherings. I prefer account books to small talk myself. His Grace keeps me employed, despite this unfortunate tendency. They spoke for several minutes about inconsequential things, but Eleanor found herself relaxing slightly. Bennet had a way of asking questions that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. When she mentioned the challenges of managing a small estate with limited resources, he listened with attention that surprised her. You handle the accounts yourself? He asked. There's no one else to do it. I taught myself from my father's ledgers after he passed. That's remarkably capable. Most ladies of your station wouldn't know a debit from a credit. Most ladies of my station have stewards and solicitors to handle such matters. I have necessity and stubbornness. Bennet laughed outright at that. His Grace would appreciate that answer. He has little patience for helplessness, affected or genuine. Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, a subtle shift in the room's energy announced someone's entrance. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they quieted slightly. People turned, their attention drawn to the doorway. The Duke of Northmere was not what Eleanor had expected. She had seen him years ago, briefly, at some county function. But he had been distant then, a figure glimpsed across a crowded room. Now, as he moved through his guests with quiet authority, she had the opportunity to truly observe him. He was tall, perhaps 6 feet or more, with broad shoulders and the bearing of a man comfortable with command. His hair was dark, almost black, with threads of silver at the temples that suggested he was in his middle 30s. His face was striking rather than handsome, all strong lines and sharp angles, with eyes of such a dark grey they appeared nearly black in the candlelight. He greeted his guests with courtesy that seemed genuine rather than perfunctory. He spoke to an elderly baronet about hunting. He listened to a local squire's concerns about road conditions. He smiled at something a young woman said, though the smile didn't quite reach his eyes. And throughout it all, Eleanor noticed him noticing things. The way a servant moved too quickly through the room, a guest standing alone near the windows, her own mother, sitting quietly by the fire, and then his gaze found Eleanor. For a moment, their eyes met across the room. Eleanor felt an odd jolt, as though she had touched something unexpectedly cold. His expression didn't change, but something in his attention sharpened. Then he turned back to his conversation, and the moment passed. Ah, Bennet said quietly beside her. He's seen you. Is that significant? With His Grace, everything is significant. Dinner was announced, and the guests began moving toward the dining room. Eleanor helped her mother stand, but Mrs. Appleby appeared again as if summoned. Lady Constance, if you prefer, I can have a tray brought to you in the library. It's quieter there, and warmer. You'd be more comfortable. Constance hesitated, then nodded. That's very kind. Eleanor, you and Oliver should dine with the others. Don't miss the meal on my account. Eleanor wanted to protest, but her mother's expression brooked no argument. She watched Mrs. Appleby lead Constance away, then turned to find Oliver had been swept up by a group of young men his own age, all of them talking animatedly about horses, which left Eleanor standing alone in a drawing room that was rapidly emptying. Lady Eleanor. She turned to find the Duke of Northmere standing a few feet away. Up close, he was even more imposing. Not in a threatening way, but in the manner of someone who had never questioned his right to occupy any space he chose. Your Grace, she said, curtsying. Thank you for your hospitality. It's very generous of you to include my family in your gathering. Your mother is comfortable. Mrs. Appleby has been extraordinarily kind. Mamma's health makes extended social engagements difficult, but she insisted on coming. For Oliver's sake, as much as anything. Your brother seems to be enjoying himself, the Duke observed, glancing toward where Oliver was laughing with his new acquaintances. Thomas tells me you manage your family's estate personally. That's an unusual accomplishment for a woman of any station. Eleanor felt heat rise in her cheeks, though whether from embarrassment or anger she couldn't quite say. Unusual circumstances require unusual adaptations, Your Grace. I meant no offense. I find competence admirable, regardless of who possesses it. He paused, then added, Would you permit me to escort you into dinner, since your mother is otherwise engaged? It was not a question one refused when asked by a duke. Eleanor placed her hand lightly on his offered arm, acutely aware of how shabby her glove looked against the fine wool of his coat. They moved toward the dining room together, and Eleanor felt every eye in the room marking the moment. The dining table seated 30, and Eleanor found herself placed neither at the far end with the least important guests, nor near the Duke at the head. She was positioned in the middle, between a pleasant baronet's wife who talked enthusiastically about her grandchildren, and a gentleman who introduced himself as a magistrate from the next county. The conversation was easy, undemanding, and Eleanor found herself relaxing despite her earlier anxiety. But throughout the meal, she was aware of the Duke. He sat at the head of the table, conversing with the guests nearest him, but several times she caught him watching her. Not obviously, not in any way that would draw comment, but his attention returned to her again and again, as though he were solving some puzzle she presented. When the ladies withdrew after dinner, leaving the gentlemen to their port and cigars, Eleanor slipped away from the drawing room and went in search of her mother. She found Constance in the library, a beautiful room lined with books from floor to ceiling, a fire burning cheerfully in the grate. Her mother was dozing in a comfortable chair, a blanket over her lap, her breathing easier than it had been in weeks. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a moment, simply watching. This was what money could buy. Not just fine clothes and elegant dinners, but warmth and comfort, and the kind of care that made the difference between merely surviving and actually living. She felt a sharp pang of longing so intense it was almost physical. She fell asleep about an hour ago. Eleanor started and turned to find the Duke standing behind her in the corridor. She hadn't heard him approach. "I'm sorry," she said quickly. "I should have stayed with the other ladies. I just wanted to check on her." "Don't apologize. Family is more important than social convention." He moved to stand beside her in the doorway, looking at Constance's sleeping form. "Thomas mentioned your mother has been ill for some time. A chronic lung complaint. It's worse in winter." Eleanor hesitated, then added, "This is the warmest she's been in months. Our house is difficult to heat properly." She hadn't meant to say that, hadn't meant to reveal anything about their circumstances, but something about the Duke's quiet presence, the way he simply listened without judgment, loosened her tongue. "I'm glad Northmere Hall could provide some comfort then," he said. "If she's too tired to travel tonight, you're welcome to stay. I can have rooms prepared." "That's very kind, but we couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition if I'm offering." He turned to look at her directly, and Eleanor found herself meeting those dark grey eyes. "I remember your father, you know. He came to me once, years ago, asking advice about some investments. I told him the ventures were too risky, that he should be conservative with his capital. He thanked me for my counsel and ignored it completely." Eleanor felt her throat tighten. That sounds like him. He was always certain the next opportunity would restore everything he'd lost. "I'm sorry he was wrong, and I'm sorry his decisions left you to manage the consequences." It was perhaps the most honest thing anyone had said to her in 3 years. Not sympathy, not pity, just acknowledgement of an unfair reality. Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes and blinked them back furiously. "Thank you," she managed. Thank you." They stood in silence for a moment, watching Constance sleep. Then the Duke said, "The gentleman will be rejoining the ladies shortly. You should return before your absence is noted. But if your mother wakes and wishes to go home, have Mrs. Appleby send for me. I'll arrange your carriage." Eleanor curtsied and left him there. She returned to the drawing room, where the other ladies were discussing the comparative merits of various London modistes. She sat on the edge of a settee and contributed nothing to the conversation, her mind still turning over the Duke's words. He had known her father, he had tried to help, and now he was trying to help her in small ways that preserved her dignity while offering assistance. The realization was both comforting and unsettling. When the gentleman returned, the Duke made his way around the room, speaking briefly with each group. When he reached Eleanor, he paused. "I hope you've enjoyed the evening, Lady Eleanor." "Very much, Your Grace. You've been a gracious host." "I was wondering," he said, his tone casual, "if you might permit me to call on you in the coming days. There are some matters regarding estate management in the area that I'd like to discuss, and Thomas speaks highly of your practical knowledge." Eleanor blinked, caught off guard. A duke did not call on impoverished viscountesses to discuss estate management, but his expression was perfectly serious, perfectly proper. "Of course, Your Grace. You would be most welcome at Fairmont Manor." "Excellent. I'll send word before I visit." He inclined his head and moved on to the next group, leaving Eleanor staring after him in bewilderment. Oliver appeared at her elbow, his face flushed with excitement. "Eleanor, you'll never believe it. One of the gentlemen I was talking to knows the Dean of Admissions at Oxford. He said he'd be happy to write a letter on my behalf when the time comes." "That's wonderful, Oliver," Eleanor said, meaning it. Perhaps this evening had been worthwhile after all. Perhaps there were still people in the world who offered kindness without expecting anything in return. They collected their mother an hour later. Constance was more rested than she had been in weeks. Her colour better, her breathing easier. The borrowed carriage carried them home through the dark countryside, and Oliver talked the entire way about horses and hunting, and all the conversations he'd had with young men who seemed to actually like him. Eleanor said little. She was thinking about dark grey eyes and a quiet voice acknowledging unfair realities. She was thinking about an invitation that made no sense and probably meant nothing. But as the carriage rolled through the gates of Fairmont Manor and their cold, draughty house came into view, she allowed herself to wonder, just for a moment, just for the space of a heartbeat. Perhaps something had changed tonight. Perhaps the world was not quite as closed to them as she had believed. Perhaps there was still a chance for something better. The Duke of Northmere called on Fairmont Manor 3 days after the gathering, and in the weeks that followed, his visits became a pattern as reliable as the winter frost that silvered the Yorkshire fields each morning. The first visit, Eleanor had been prepared for him. She had worn her best remaining dress, arranged her hair carefully, instructed Mrs. Davies to serve what little tea they had left in the porcelain pot that wasn't chipped. She had expected formality, the kind of distant courtesy that marked interactions between vastly different social stations. Instead, the Duke had arrived on horseback rather than by carriage, declined tea in favour of touring the grounds, and asked detailed questions about crop rotation and drainage that suggested genuine interest rather than mere politeness. The second visit, 2 days later, he had found her in the north field directing the repair of a fence that had finally given up entirely. She had been wearing her oldest dress, her hands muddy, her hair escaping its pins. She had been mortified. He had dismounted, removed his coat, and helped Oliver lift the section of fence into place while discussing the merits of different wood treatments for preventing rot. By the fourth visit, Eleanor had stopped trying to prepare. The Duke seemed to prefer Fairmont Manor at its most honest, without pretense or performance. He discussed accounts with her in the study, talked literature with her mother in the drawing room, and took Oliver riding across the estate, teaching him things about horsemanship that the boy absorbed with desperate enthusiasm. "He's going to notice," Constance said one afternoon, watching from the window as the Duke and Oliver returned from one such ride, both of them laughing about something. "That you're falling in love with him." Eleanor's hands stilled on the mending in her lap. "Don't be absurd. I'm your mother. I notice things." Constance turned from the window, her expression gentle. "And I see the way you watch him when you think no one is looking. The way you come alive when he visits. You've been merely existing for so long, Eleanor. But with him, you live again. He's a duke," Eleanor said quietly. "I'm the impoverished daughter of a man who made disastrous investments. This friendship, or whatever it is, has no future beyond what it is now. I understand that. Does he?" Eleanor had no answer to that. She returned her attention to the mending, but her hands trembled slightly as she worked. The truth was more complicated than she had admitted to her mother. Julian Grayson, the Duke of Northmere, was not what she had expected in any way. He was intelligent, yes, but so were many men. He was wealthy and titled, but those were accidents of birth. What surprised her was his fundamental decency, the way he listened when people spoke, truly listened rather than simply waiting for his turn to talk, the way he treated servants with the same courtesy he showed peers, the way he looked at problems and saw solutions rather than insurmountable obstacles, and the way he looked at her, as though she were someone worth knowing, as though her opinions mattered, as though the circumstances that defined her to the rest of the world were merely background rather than her entire identity. It was dangerous, feeling seen like that. It made her want things she had taught herself not to want. Today, he had come to see the account books, or so he had said. Eleanor spread them across her father's desk, their pages worn, and the ink sometimes smudged from her tired hands at the end of long days. "You've managed remarkably well," Julian said, studying the columns. He sat in the chair across from her, his presence somehow making the shabby study feel less bleak. "Most estates this size require at least a steward and a land agent. You're doing the work of 3 people. Necessity is an excellent teacher," Eleanor replied, "though I'll admit there are times when I reach the limits of my knowledge. Agricultural practices, legal matters, that sort of thing. I learn as I go and hope I'm not making terrible mistakes." "You're not." He turned a page, his finger tracing down a column of expenditures. "Your priorities are sound. Food and medicine before luxury, necessary repairs before aesthetic improvements. You've kept the estate functioning on almost nothing." "Almost nothing is still more than nothing," Eleanor said wryly, "though the margin narrows every year." Julian looked up at her, his dark grey eyes serious. "Thomas heard something in the village. Creditors making inquiries about this property. Is that true?" Eleanor felt her stomach tighten. She had hoped that particular humiliation wasn't yet common knowledge. "Yes. My father's debts were larger than I initially understood. The creditors have been patient, but their patience isn't infinite." "How large?" "Does it matter?" "It might, if you trust me enough to tell me." Eleanor hesitated. Pride warred with pragmatism. Pride had sustained her through 3 years of genteel poverty, but pride wouldn't save Fairmont Manor. Slowly, she reached for a different ledger, one she normally kept locked in the desk drawer. She opened it and turned it so Julian could see. The number at the bottom of the page was devastating in its simplicity. More money than the estate could generate in 5 years, even if every season was perfect and every crop sold at peak price. Julian studied the figure in silence. His expression didn't change, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested he understood exactly how impossible the situation was. "I see," he said finally. "Now you understand why I learned estate management," Eleanor said, trying for lightness and not quite achieving it. "I couldn't afford not to, and I couldn't burden my mother or Oliver with the full extent of it. So I manage, and I hope, and I try not to think too far into the future. You shouldn't have to carry this alone. I don't have a choice." Julian closed the ledger carefully and pushed it back across the desk. "There are always choices. Some of them just aren't obvious until someone helps you see them." Before Eleanor could ask what he meant, Oliver burst into the study with the kind of energy that only teenage boys possessed. "Eleanor, the fence in the south pasture has broken again. I can fix it, but I'll need help moving the posts. And Mama is asking for you. She's having one of her difficult days." The moment shattered. Eleanor rose immediately, the accounts forgotten. "I'll come at once. Your Grace, I apologize, but—" "Go," Julian said, standing as well. "Family comes first. Always." She hurried from the study, following Oliver up the stairs to where Constance lay in her bed, breathing in shallow, laboured gasps. These episodes came without warning, her lungs seizing and refusing to work properly. Dr. Porter had been twice this month already, each time with the same gentle sympathy and the same expensive medicines that helped only temporarily. Eleanor spent the rest of the afternoon at her mother's bedside, reading aloud when Constance could listen, simply holding her hand when she couldn't. She heard the Duke leave, his horse cantering down the drive. She heard Oliver working on the fence. She heard Mrs. Davies moving about downstairs, preparing what would pass for dinner. By evening, Constance was breathing easier, though the effort had exhausted her. She slept fitfully, and Eleanor sat in the chair beside the bed, too tired to move, too worried to rest. A soft knock at the door announced Mrs. Davies. "Miss Eleanor." His Grace returned. "He's brought Dr. Porter and some medicines. Says he thought they might be needed." Eleanor's throat tightened. She rose and went downstairs to find Julian in the entrance hall with Dr. Porter, who was removing his coat and gathering his medical bag. "I took the liberty," Julian said simply. "I hope you don't mind." Eleanor couldn't speak. She managed a nod, then led Dr. Porter upstairs. The physician examined Constance with gentle thoroughness, administered new medicines, and left instructions for her care. When he departed an hour later, Julian was still waiting. "Thank you," Eleanor said. Her voice sounded strange to her own ears, raw and uncertain. "You didn't have to do that." "I know." He paused, then added, "Walk with me. Just to the garden. You've been sitting all afternoon." She should refuse. It was improper, walking alone with a man in the twilight. But propriety seemed less important than the way her back ached from sitting, the way her head pounded from worry, the way Julian's quiet presence made everything feel slightly less impossible. The garden was winter bare, but someone, probably Oliver, had cleared the paths of snow. They walked in silence for several minutes, their breath misting in the cold air. Eleanor wrapped her shawl tighter and tried to find words for what she was feeling. "Why are you doing this?" she asked finally. "The visits, the help, the kindness. You're a duke. You could be anywhere, doing anything. Why spend time here?" Julian was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. Then he said, "Do you know what my life is like in London? I'm surrounded by people every day. Servants, secretaries, petitioners, social climbers. Everyone wants something. A favour, an introduction, a business connection. No one sees me, Julian. They see the duke, the title, the fortune. They perform for me, and I perform for them, and it's all utterly hollow." He stopped walking and turned to face her. In the fading light, his face was all planes and shadows, but his eyes were direct and honest. "You don't perform," he continued. "You showed me your account books without shame. You let me see your struggle and your strength. You talk to me as though I'm simply a man, not a title. Do you have any idea how rare that is? How valuable?" Eleanor's heart was beating too fast. "I talk to you that way because I have nothing left to lose. I can't impress you with wealth or connections I don't have. All I can offer is honesty." "That's exactly my point." He stepped closer, and Eleanor was acutely aware of the space between them. How small it was, how easily crossed. "You offer the one thing most people in my life won't give me. The truth." They stood there in the winter garden as darkness fell around them, and Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in the air between them. This was no longer simply kindness or even friendship. This was something more dangerous, more complicated, something that could hurt them both if it went wrong. "Your Grace," she began, but he shook his head. "Julian," he said quietly. "When we're alone, call me Julian." That wouldn't be appropriate. Nothing about this is appropriate by society's standards. But I find I care less and less about what society thinks. The garden gate creaked, and they stepped apart quickly. Oliver appeared on the path, calling for Eleanor about dinner. The moment broke, but its weight lingered as they walked back to the house together. Over the following days, Julian's visits continued. But now there was an undercurrent to every conversation, every glance. Eleanor told herself to be careful, to guard her heart, to remember the impossibility of their situations. But it was like trying to hold back the tide. Every conversation drew them closer. Every shared smile, every moment of understanding, every honest exchange bound them together in ways that defied logic or propriety. Constance watched it all with maternal concern and hope warring in her expression. Oliver, oblivious to anything beyond his own happiness at having a mentor he admired, simply glowed with contentment. And Eleanor tried desperately to remember all the reasons this couldn't possibly end well. even as she fell deeper and deeper into something she couldn't quite name, but recognized as inevitable. One afternoon, nearly a month after that first gathering, Eleanor went searching for Julian and found him in the small stable behind the house. He had removed his coat and was repairing a broken bridle, his hands working with surprising competence. "This is not how dukes typically spend their afternoons," she observed from the doorway. He looked up and smiled. "I grew up here, you know, before I inherited, before London. I learned these skills from the stable master at Northmere Hall. My father thought it beneath me, but I always found peace in working with my hands." Eleanor moved into the stable, watching his fingers manipulate the leather. "I wouldn't have expected that. Most people wouldn't. That's why I don't tell them." He knotted the leather and tested the repair. "There, that should hold." "Thank you. We can't afford a new bridle." "I know." He set the bridle aside and looked at her directly. "Eleanor, I need to tell you something. I've been making inquiries about your father's creditors, about the debts." Eleanor's stomach dropped. "Why would you do that?" "Because I wanted to understand the full situation. Because I thought perhaps there might be a way to help." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "The amounts are manageable for someone with resources. Not easily, but possible." "I can't accept charity," Eleanor said immediately. "I know you mean well, but it wouldn't be charity. It would be—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Eleanor, these past weeks have meant more to me than I can easily express. You've given me something I didn't know I was missing. Purpose, honesty, a reason to wake up each morning that has nothing to do with obligation or duty. I can't stand by and watch you lose everything when I have the means to prevent it." Eleanor's hands were shaking. "You're talking about paying my debts, about saving my estate. Julian, I can't ask that of you. I won't." "You're not asking. I'm offering." "Why?" The word came out raw, almost desperate. "Why would you do that?" He crossed the space between them in 2 strides. His hands came up to frame her face, gentle but firm, and Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Because somewhere between account books and broken fences, between your mother's courage and your brother's enthusiasm, between every honest word you've ever spoken to me, I fell in love with you," he said. "And I can't watch the woman I love lose everything when I have the power to prevent it." Then he kissed her, and Eleanor's carefully constructed walls shattered completely. She kissed him back, her hands clutching his shirt. 3 years of loneliness and fear and desperate hope pouring into that single moment. It was inevitable and impossible, wonderful and terrifying. Everything she had told herself not to want, and the only thing she had wanted for weeks. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Eleanor pressed her forehead to his shoulder and tried to remember all the reasons this was a terrible idea. But for the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than fear. She felt hope, and it was the most dangerous feeling of all. The invitation to the skating party at Northmere Hall arrived on a morning when frost painted intricate patterns across the windows of Fairmont Manor. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall, the heavy cream paper in her hands, reading the elegant script for the 3rd time while her conscience waged war with her heart. "You must go," Constance said from the drawing room doorway. She leaned against the frame, wrapped in shawls despite the meagre fire burning in the grate. "All 3 of you. This is exactly the kind of event Oliver should attend. The cold would be dangerous for you," Eleanor said, moving to support her mother's elbow. "The lake, the wind, hours outdoors. Dr. Porter specifically said." "I know what Dr. Porter said." Constance allowed herself to be led to the chair nearest the fire. "Which is why I'll remain here, perfectly comfortable with Mrs. Davies and a good book. But you and Oliver should go." The Duke went to considerable effort to revive this tradition. It would be rude to decline. Eleanor knew her mother was right, but the thought of attending made her stomach tight with apprehension. In the 2 weeks since Julian had kissed her in the stable, since he had spoken words that had rearranged her entire understanding of what was possible, their relationship had existed in a strange suspended state. He continued to visit, but now every conversation carried weight. Every glance meant something. Every accidental touch sent awareness sparking through her skin. They had not discussed what had happened. They had not defined what they were to each other. And Eleanor lived in constant fear that the dream would shatter, that reality would intrude, that she would wake to find none of it had been real. "He'll expect you to be there," Constance said gently, as though reading her daughter's thoughts. "And you want to see him. Stop fighting what makes you happy, Eleanor. You've forgotten what joy feels like. Let yourself remember." So on the day of the skating party, Eleanor and Oliver made the journey to Northmere Hall in the borrowed carriage. Oliver talked excitedly about the skating he'd done as a boy, before their father's death, before everything had changed. Eleanor let his enthusiasm wash over her while her own nerves twisted tighter with each mile. Northmere Hall's grounds had been transformed. The large ornamental lake behind the house, frozen solid by weeks of bitter cold, had been cleared of snow. Torches lined the banks, their flames bright against the grey winter sky. Tables laden with food and hot drinks stood beneath canvas pavilions. And everywhere, people. Families from neighbouring estates, friends from London, easily 60 or 70 guests, all dressed in furs and fine wool, their voices carrying across the ice. Eleanor and Oliver joined the crowd, and immediately several young men swept Oliver away toward the ice. Eleanor stood alone for a moment, suddenly acutely aware of her patched cloak and her old skating boots, borrowed from the same cousin who had lent the dress. "Lady Eleanor." Thomas Bennet appeared at her elbow, his kind face welcoming. "His Grace was hoping you'd attend. He's been watching the drive for the past hour." "Has he?" Eleanor tried to keep her voice neutral, but warmth spread through her chest regardless. "Indeed. Though he's currently trapped in conversation with Lady Harriet Wycliffe. She arrived from London yesterday and has barely left his side since." Eleanor followed Thomas's gaze and saw Julian standing near one of the pavilions. Even at a distance he was imposing, his dark coat stark against the snow, and beside him, close enough to be possessive, stood a woman Eleanor had never seen before. Lady Harriet Wycliffe was perhaps 26, beautiful in the way that came from perfect features and expensive taste. Her fur-trimmed pelisse was the latest fashion, her blonde hair arranged in artful curls beneath a matching hat. She touched Julian's arm as she spoke, laughed at something he said, tilted her head in a way that suggested long familiarity. Eleanor felt something cold and sharp lodge beneath her breastbone. "She's been pursuing him for 2 years, Thomas said quietly, "since her husband died. His Grace has been polite but distant. But Lady Harriet is nothing, if not persistent." "It's none of my concern," Eleanor said, the lie bitter on her tongue. "Isn't it?" Thomas gave her a knowing look. "I've worked for His Grace for 7 years, Lady Eleanor. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Whatever you think you saw just now, remember that." Before Eleanor could respond, Julian extricated himself from Lady Harriet and began walking toward them. His expression when he saw Eleanor was unguarded for just a moment, relief and something warmer flooding his features, before his usual composure returned. "Lady Eleanor," he said, bowing over her hand. His fingers lingered a fraction longer than propriety allowed. "I'm delighted you could attend. Will you skate with me?" It was not really a question. Eleanor found herself being guided toward the ice, acutely aware of the eyes following them, of Lady Harriet's sharp gaze, of the whispers that rippled through the crowd. Julian helped her onto the ice with steady hands. Eleanor had not skated in years, and her first few strokes were uncertain, but Julian skated with the easy confidence of someone who had grown up on this lake, and his presence beside her was steadying. "I was afraid you wouldn't come," he said quietly as they glided away from the crowded centre of the lake. "My mother insisted. She's quite determined that Oliver should take advantage of every social opportunity." "And what about you? What do you want?" Eleanor glanced at him, at the way the cold had brought colour to his face, at the intensity in his dark grey eyes. "I want things I shouldn't want, things that don't make sense." "Such as?" "You know what." See, they skated in silence for a moment, moving in slow circles at the edge of the ice. The sounds of laughter and conversation faded slightly, giving them an illusion of privacy. "I've been thinking," Julian said finally, "about what I said 2 weeks ago, about how I feel." "Eleanor, I meant every word. I know you did. That's what frightens me. Why should it frighten you? Eleanor stopped skating, forcing him to stop as well. Around them, other skaters glided past, but for a moment it felt as though they were alone in the winter landscape. Because you're a duke, she said, keeping her voice low. Because I'm the daughter of a man who died in debt. Because whatever this is between us, it has no future beyond stolen moments and impossible dreams, and I can't afford to hope for more. Hope is too expensive for someone in my position. Julian's jaw tightened. What if I told you that your position doesn't matter to me? That your father's debts mean nothing? That I don't care about any of it? Then I would say you're not thinking clearly. Your family, your peers, society itself would never accept me, and I won't be the woman who ruins your reputation or makes you choose between duty and desire. You're assuming I would choose duty. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Eleanor felt her breath catch, felt hope and fear warring in her chest. Before she could respond, a commotion near the shore drew their attention. Voices raised in alarm, people pointing. And then Eleanor saw Oliver, skating fast toward the far edge of the lake, where the ice extended into a narrow channel. "Oliver!" she called, but her voice was lost in the sudden chaos. Julian's hand tightened on hers. "That area isn't safe. The current keeps the ice thinner there. Stay here." He released her and skated quickly toward the shore, calling out warnings. But Oliver was too far away, too caught up in showing off for his new friends. Eleanor watched in growing horror as he ventured further out, into the area where no one else was skating. She heard the crack before she saw it, a sound like breaking timber, sharp and final. Then Oliver was falling, the ice giving way beneath him, and he was in the water. Eleanor screamed. She didn't remember moving, didn't remember skating toward the broken section of ice. She only knew that Oliver was drowning, that the freezing water would kill him in minutes, that she had to reach him. "Eleanor, no!" Julian's voice, sharp with command. But she couldn't stop. The ice cracked beneath her own weight. She had a single moment of clarity, seeing the dark water below, understanding what was about to happen. Then she was falling, and the cold was so intense it drove the air from her lungs. The shock of submersion was absolute. Every nerve in her body screamed. The water was so cold it felt like being stabbed with 1,000 knives. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. She could see light above her, refracted through the ice and water, but her heavy skirts were dragging her down. She reached upward, her fingers breaking through into air for just a moment. She heard shouting, screaming, saw shadows moving above the ice, tried to call out but swallowed water instead. Her vision was starting to darken at the edges. Her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive. This was how she would die, she thought with strange clarity, drowning in a frozen lake while trying to save her brother. Then something broke through the ice above her with tremendous force. Hands, large and strong, grabbed her wrist. She was being pulled, dragged upward through water that felt thick as honey. Her head broke the surface, and she gasped, choking on air and water. Julian's face, terrible in its intensity. His hands gripping her arms, her shoulders, pulling her up through the broken ice. She saw that he was soaked, that he had broken through the ice with his bare hands to reach her. Blood ran from his palms where the sharp edges had cut him. "I've got you," he said, his voice rough. "Eleanor, I've got you. Hold on." She tried to help, tried to pull herself up, but her body wouldn't obey. Julian was lifting her bodily from the water, his strength seemingly inexhaustible. Then they were on solid ice, and he was carrying her, running toward the shore while people scattered before them. "Oliver," she tried to say, but her teeth were chattering too violently. "Already out. Thomas pulled him. He's safe." Eleanor's last clear thought before consciousness began to slip was that Julian's coat was soaked through, that his hands were bleeding, that he had destroyed the ice with nothing but his own strength and will because she had been drowning. Then everything went dark, and she knew nothing more. She woke in unfamiliar surroundings. A bedroom, large and warm. A fire blazing in a substantial hearth. Heavy blankets covered her, and she was wearing a nightgown she didn't recognize. Her body ached as though she'd been beaten, and her lungs burned with every breath. "You're awake." "Thank God." Julian sat in a chair beside the bed. He looked haggard, his hair dishevelled, his shirt wrinkled. His hands were bandaged, and there were shadows beneath his eyes that suggested he hadn't slept. "How long?" Eleanor's voice came out as barely a whisper. 3 days. You've been drifting in and out. The doctor said your body needed time to recover from the cold." He leaned forward, his expression intense. "Eleanor, you could have died. When I saw you go through the ice, when I saw you sinking, His voice broke. He stopped, composed himself. "I've never been so terrified in my life. Oliver is fine, shaken, guilt-ridden, but physically unharmed. He's been asking about you constantly. Your mother is here as well. We brought her when it became clear you weren't waking immediately." Eleanor tried to sit up and immediately regretted it. Her head swam and her muscles protested. Julian was there instantly, supporting her, adjusting the pillows. "Your hands," she said, seeing the bandages. "You hurt yourself. Breaking through the ice. It doesn't matter. You're alive. That's all that matters." They sat in silence for a moment. Eleanor could hear voices in the distance, footsteps in the corridor, could smell wood smoke and something medicinal, could feel the warmth slowly seeping back into bones that had been frozen. "I need to tell you something," Julian said. His voice was quiet but firm. "While you were unconscious, while I sat here wondering if you would wake, I made some decisions. I've already instructed my solicitors. Your father's debts have been paid, all of them. The house is secure." Eleanor's breath caught. "You had no right. I had every right. You nearly died saving your brother. You've spent 3 years sacrificing everything for your family. Someone needed to help you, and I had the means to do it. The papers are already filed. It's done. Julian, I can't accept that. I can't let you—" "It's not a gift," he said. His hands found hers, careful of her injuries. "It's an investment in our future. Eleanor, I want to marry you. I'm asking you to be my wife." The room seemed to tilt. Eleanor stared at him, unable to process the words. "You can't be serious. I've never been more serious about anything. I love you. I want to spend my life with you. And I won't hear arguments about station or propriety or what society thinks. None of that matters." "It all matters," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "Your family will object. Your peers will mock you. And I'll always be the woman you had to rescue, the poor relation you took pity on. That's not a foundation for marriage. That's not what this is. Isn't it? You paid my debts without asking. You've swept in like some fairy tale prince and solved all my problems. How can I possibly say yes, knowing that I'm accepting not just you, but your charity? How can I marry you, knowing I'll never be sure if you asked out of love or obligation?" The words came out harsher than she intended, but they needed to be said. Julian's expression shuttered, hurt flickering across his features before his control returned. "I see," he said quietly. "You don't trust my feelings. Or perhaps you don't trust your own. I don't trust any of this. It's too much, too fast. 2 months ago you were a stranger. Now you're asking me to marry you, telling me you've rearranged my entire life without my consent. I don't even know who I am in this situation, Julian. Am I Eleanor Fairmont, a woman with agency and choices, or am I just another problem you've solved?" He stood abruptly, his movements stiff. "When you're ready to leave, I'll arrange transportation home. Your mother and brother can stay as long as they need. I apologize for overstepping." "Julian," but he was already at the door, already leaving. Eleanor heard his footsteps recede down the corridor, heard a door close somewhere in the distance, and she was alone in the beautiful room, surrounded by comfort she hadn't earned and safety purchased with someone else's money. She pressed her hands to her face and tried not to cry. But the tears came anyway, hot and bitter, mourning something she had lost before she fully understood what she had. Eleanor was strong enough to travel within the week, though Dr. Porter insisted she needed continued rest. Oliver came to see her every day, his face tight with guilt that no amount of reassurance could ease. Her mother visited more quietly, sitting beside Eleanor's bed and saying very little, but her eyes carried a sadness that spoke of understanding. Julian did not come at all. "He's been occupied with estate business," Thomas said delicately, when he brought Eleanor books from the library. "And I believe he feels his presence would be unwelcome given your last conversation." Eleanor said nothing. What could she say? That she regretted her words? That she wished she could take them back? That pride had made her cruel when he had offered her everything she had ever wanted. But the truth remained beneath all of it. She didn't know how to accept what he offered, without losing herself entirely. On the morning of her departure, Mrs. Appleby helped her dress in borrowed clothes, her own having been ruined by the lake water. Oliver carried her small bag down to the waiting carriage. Constance followed more slowly, her breathing better after a week in Northmere Hall's warm rooms, but still fragile. Eleanor stood in the entrance hall and looked around at the elegant space, the beautiful home that had sheltered them. Somewhere in this house was Julian, and she ached to see him one more time, to explain what she hadn't been able to articulate, to tell him that her rejection wasn't of him, but of her own fear. But he didn't appear, and Eleanor couldn't bring herself to ask for him. The journey home was silent. Oliver stared out the window, lost in his own thoughts. Constance dozed, exhausted from the morning's exertion. And Eleanor tried not to think about dark grey eyes and bandaged hands and a proposal she had thrown back like something worthless. Fairmont Manor looked smaller than she remembered, colder. The rooms felt empty, despite Mrs. Davies's attempts to warm them. Eleanor went through the motions of settling her mother, checking on household matters, pretending that everything was normal. But nothing felt normal. Nothing felt right. That evening, sitting alone in her father's study, Eleanor opened the desk drawer where she kept the most important papers, and there, on top of everything else, was a document she had never seen before. Heavy paper, official seals, legal language she had to read twice to understand. The deed to Fairmont Manor. Free and clear. All debts satisfied. The property transferred wholly to Lady Eleanor Fairmont. No encumbrances, no obligations. Her hands shook as she read it. Julian had done exactly what he said he would. He had saved her home, secured her future, and asked for nothing in return. Even after she had rejected him, accused him of treating her like a problem to solve, he had ensured she would be safe. Eleanor pressed the document to her chest and finally allowed herself to break. She wept for her own pride, for the hurt she had seen in Julian's eyes, for the love she had been too frightened to accept. She wept until she had no tears left, and then she sat in the darkness and tried to figure out how to live with what she had done. The weeks that followed were bleak. Winter deepened its grip on Yorkshire, and Eleanor moved through her days like a ghost. She managed the estate because it was what she did. She cared for her mother because it was her duty. She tried to support Oliver, who had grown quiet and withdrawn, haunted by the accident that had nearly killed them both. But joy had left her life, and she didn't know how to find it again. The gossip reached them in fragments. A comment from a tradesman in the village, a letter from a distant cousin, whispered conversations that fell silent when Eleanor entered a room. The story of what had happened at the skating party had spread through the county like wildfire, and with it came speculation. Lady Eleanor Fairmont nearly drowned, the Duke of Northmere risking his life to save her. Her family staying at Northmere Hall for days, and now the Duke maintaining his distance, and Eleanor returned to her isolated manor. The conclusions drawn were inevitable and cruel. She had tried to trap him. She had engineered the entire situation. The Duke had been too honourable to abandon her completely, but he had clearly recognised her for what she was, an opportunist, a social climber, a woman who would use any means to improve her situation. Lady Harriet Wycliffe, back in London, was reportedly delighted by this turn of events. Visconde Hartley called again, his expression triumphant. Eleanor received him in the drawing room with cold courtesy. "I heard about your misadventure," he said, not bothering to hide his satisfaction. "And the subsequent awkwardness with the Duke. How unfortunate that your gambit failed. I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you? The entire county is talking about it, my dear. The poor desperate Viscountess who threw herself in the Duke's path, quite literally." He moved closer, and Eleanor resisted the urge to step back. "My offer still stands, you know. I'm not deterred by a little scandal. In fact, I find your situation even more appealing now. Fewer alternatives, you see. Fewer choices. Get out, Eleanor said quietly. Get out of my house and don't come back. Your house? Hartley smiled. I wonder who actually paid for that security. Though I suppose technically it is your house now, bought and paid for, just not by you. Eleanor walked to the door and opened it. Leave, now. He went, but his laughter echoed in the hallway. Eleanor closed the door and leaned against it, her whole body shaking with rage and humiliation. That night, Constance found Eleanor in the study, staring at nothing. You need to tell me what happened, her mother said gently. The truth, Eleanor, not the version you've been presenting. What really happened between you and the Duke? So Eleanor told her. Everything. The growing closeness, the kiss in the stable, Julian's confession of love, the proposal after the accident, her rejection, and why, the confusion and fear that had made her lash out when he had offered her everything. Constance listened without interrupting. When Eleanor finished, her mother was quiet for a long moment. Do you love him? She asked finally. Yes, Eleanor whispered. So much it terrifies me. Then why did you refuse him? Because I don't know how to be saved, Mama. I've spent 3 years being strong, being self-sufficient, refusing to need anyone. And then Julian appeared, and suddenly I wanted to need him. I wanted to let him carry some of the weight. But what if I'm wrong? What if I'm just tired and desperate and confusing gratitude with love? What if he's confusing pity with something deeper? Eleanor. Constance reached across the space between them and took her daughter's hand. Do you remember why your father and I struggled so much financially? It wasn't just the bad investments. It was his pride. He refused to ask for help when he needed it. He refused to admit when he was wrong. He chose pride over practicality, and it destroyed us. I know. You're doing the same thing. You're so afraid of appearing weak, of needing help, that you're throwing away the best thing that's ever happened to you. Constance squeezed Eleanor's hand. Accepting love isn't weakness. Accepting help from someone who cares for you isn't charity. It's what people do when they build lives together. They support each other. They carry each other's burdens. That's not shame. That's partnership. Eleanor felt tears slipping down her cheeks. But what if? Stop asking what if. Start asking what is. The Duke loves you. You love him. Everything else is just fear talking. I hurt him, Mama. You should have seen his face when I accused him of treating me like a problem to solve. I was cruel. Then apologize. Explain. Tell him the truth instead of hiding behind pride. Constance's voice was firm. And do it soon, before Lady Harriet convinces him that he's better off without you. The mention of Lady Harriet sent a spike of jealousy through Eleanor's chest. She had been so focused on her own wounded pride that she hadn't considered Julian might move on, might decide she was more trouble than she was worth, might accept the easier path that someone like Harriet represented. The thought was unbearable. I don't know if he'll listen, Eleanor said. I don't know if he'll forgive me. You won't know unless you try. Eleanor sat alone in the study long after her mother had gone to bed. The fire burned low. The house settled into nighttime quiet. And slowly, carefully, she began to write. The letter took her hours. She wrote and discarded a dozen versions before she found the words that felt true. She explained her fear without excuse. She apologized for her cruelty without expectation of forgiveness. She told him that she loved him, that she had been terrified of that love, that she understood if it was too late, but needed him to know the truth. When she finally finished, the grey light of dawn was filtering through the windows. Eleanor sealed the letter with wax and addressed it to the Duke of Northmere. Then she called for Oliver. I need you to deliver this to Northmere Hall, she said, pressing the letter into his hands. Personally. Don't give it to a servant. Give it directly to the Duke and tell him I'm sorry. Can you do that? Oliver looked at the letter, then at his sister's face. Whatever he saw there made him nod. I'll leave immediately. He returned that afternoon, his expression somber. Did you give it to him? Eleanor asked, her heart pounding. I did. He read it while I waited. Oliver hesitated. He didn't say anything, Eleanor. He just thanked me and asked me to give you this. He held out a sealed envelope. Eleanor took it with trembling hands and broke the seal. Inside was a single sentence in Julian's precise handwriting. "I'll wait. However long it takes, I'll wait. But you have to be the one to come to me. You have to choose this without reservation, or it will never work." Eleanor read the words 3 times. It wasn't rejection, but it wasn't acceptance either. It was a challenge, a requirement, an ultimatum born not of cruelty, but of respect. He was asking her to be brave, to overcome her pride, to choose love over fear, and Eleanor realized that was exactly what she needed to do. Not for him, not for her family, but for herself. She needed to prove that she could accept love without losing who she was. That strength included the courage to be vulnerable. She just wasn't sure she knew how. But as she stood in the cold study of Fairmont Manor, clutching Julian's note like a lifeline, Eleanor made herself a promise. She would find the courage. She would choose love. She would learn to accept being saved without feeling diminished. She just needed time to figure out how. Time, however, was not on her side, because while Eleanor wrestled with her pride and her fear, the world continued to turn. And sometimes the world had plans of its own, plans that would force her hand in ways she could never have anticipated. The gossip grew worse as February arrived. Eleanor heard it in fragments, each piece more cutting than the last. The county had decided on its narrative, and she was the villain. The scheming woman who had tried to trap a duke, the fortune hunter who had nearly succeeded, the scandal that Northmere Hall had barely avoided. Oliver stopped going into the village. The young men who had befriended him at the skating party no longer called. When Eleanor sent him to the market, he returned with his jaw tight and his eyes shadowed, refusing to speak about what had been said. Constance's health, which had improved during their stay at Northmere Hall, began to deteriorate again. The warm rooms and good food and excellent care had made a difference. But back in the cold, drafty manor, her breathing grew laboured once more. Eleanor spent increasing amounts of time at her mother's bedside, reading aloud or simply sitting in silent companionship. It was during one of these vigils that the letter arrived, not addressed to Eleanor, but to Oliver. From a distant cousin in Scotland, a man Eleanor had met perhaps twice in her life. Mr. Dalton McGregor, recently widowed with 3 young children, in need of a capable woman to manage his household. "He's offering marriage," Oliver said, bringing the letter to Eleanor in their mother's room. His voice was flat. "He heard about our circumstances. He says he can provide security, a home away from scandal. He needs a wife, and you need respectability." Eleanor took the letter and read it. The offer was straightforward, businesslike. McGregor made no pretense of affection. He needed a housekeeper and governess who would also bear the title of wife. In return, he would provide a home, an income that could support Constance and fund Oliver's education, and the respectability of marriage to a landed gentleman. He even suggested Oliver could study at the University of Edinburgh, where McGregor had connections. "You should consider it," Constance said quietly from the bed. Her voice was weak, but her eyes were clear. "It would solve many problems." "Mama, no. I'm not leaving you. I'm not leaving Yorkshire." Eleanor crumpled the letter in her hand. "And I'm certainly not marrying a stranger to escape gossip." "The gossip is destroying Oliver's future," Constance said. "And you cannot deny that. He had prospects before the accident. Now he has nothing but the taint of scandal. If you accept McGregor's offer, Oliver could have the education he deserves. I could have better care in Scotland's climate. You could have the fresh start none of us can find here. I don't want a fresh start. I want—" Eleanor stopped, unable to say the words aloud. "I want Julian. I want the life he offered me. I want to be brave enough to accept it." But the letter from McGregor represented something Eleanor understood. A transaction. An arrangement. Terms she could accept without fear because no love was involved. No vulnerability required. It would be safe, loveless, but safe. She was still holding the crumpled letter when Oliver found her in the study that evening. "Are you going to accept?" he asked. "I don't know. Part of me thinks it's the practical solution. And the other part, The other part wants to be impractical for once in my life. Eleanor smoothed the letter flat on the desk. Oliver, do you remember father? Before the investments failed, before everything fell apart. Some? I was young. He was so certain that the next venture would fix everything. So convinced that pride and determination were enough. And every time he failed, instead of asking for help, he just tried harder. Mama begged him to speak with our relatives, to seek counsel, to admit when he was drowning. But he refused, and it killed him. Not the debts themselves, but the shame of them. Oliver was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You think you're making the same mistake. I think I'm so afraid of drowning that I'm refusing the hand reaching down to pull me up. I think I'd rather marry a stranger in Scotland than risk being hurt by someone I love. And I don't know if that makes me strong or just a coward. Eleanor, do you love the Duke?" "Yes." "Does he love you?" "He said he does." "I believe him. Then why are you even considering Scotland?" Eleanor pressed her palms flat against the desk, staring at the crumpled letter. "Because love is terrifying, Oliver. Because I don't know how to need someone without losing myself. Because accepting his help, his love, his life feels like admitting I failed. You haven't failed. You've survived. There's a difference." Oliver moved to stand beside her. And when had he grown so tall? When had he become wise enough to see through her defenses? But surviving isn't living, and you deserve to live, not just survive. That night, alone in her cold bedroom, Eleanor made a decision. She would write to McGregor and decline his offer. She would go to Julian and tell him the truth. She would be brave, even if bravery terrified her. She would go in the morning. But morning brought catastrophe. The storm hit just before dawn, a late winter tempest of shocking violence. Snow and wind battered the old house. Eleanor woke to the sound of something crashing, and then Mrs. Davies was screaming from upstairs. Part of the roof over Constance's bedroom had collapsed under the weight of snow and age and years of deferred maintenance. The timbers, rotted and weakened, had finally given way. Constance was trapped in her bed, covered in debris but miraculously not seriously injured. But the damage was severe. The entire upper floor was compromised. Wind and snow poured through the hole in the roof. The house was uninhabitable in the middle of a blizzard. "We need help," Mrs. Davies said, her face pale with shock. "The lady can't be moved in this weather, not with her condition, but she can't stay here either." "I'll go," Oliver said immediately. "Northmere Hall is closest." "You can't ride in this," Eleanor protested, but Oliver was already pulling on his coat. "I can and I will. The Duke will help. I know he will." He looked at Eleanor and his expression was fierce. "He'll come for you. Even after everything, he'll come." Oliver disappeared into the storm before Eleanor could stop him. She returned to her mother's room, where Constance lay beneath blankets, shivering despite Eleanor's attempts to keep her warm. The wind howled through the broken roof. Snow accumulated on the floor. The fire in the small grate was inadequate against the brutal cold. "I'm sorry," Eleanor whispered, holding her mother's hand. "I'm so sorry. I should have found a way to maintain the house. I should have—" "Hush," Constance murmured. "You did everything you could. No one could have done more." But Eleanor knew that wasn't true. If she had accepted Julian's help months ago, the roof would have been repaired. If she had set aside her pride, they would have been safe. Her stubbornness had brought them to this. The wait was agony. An hour passed, then 2. Eleanor began to fear that Oliver hadn't made it through the storm, that he was lost somewhere in the blinding snow, that her pride had killed them all. Then she heard it. Voices in the entrance hall, footsteps on the stairs. And then Julian was in the doorway, snow-covered and breathing hard, his face grim with determination. Their eyes met across the ruined room. Eleanor saw a dozen emotions flash through his expression. Concern, relief, anger, love. All of it laid bare in that single moment. "We need to move her," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Carefully but quickly. I've brought Dr. Porter and several men. We'll take her to Northmere." He moved past Eleanor without another word, taking charge with the kind of calm authority that came from never doubting his right to command. Dr. Porter examined Constance, Julian directed the men in clearing debris. Within 30 minutes, they had Constance wrapped in blankets and being carried carefully down the stairs. "What about the house?" Eleanor asked Mrs. Davies. "Leave it," Julian said shortly. "Everyone to Northmere. Now." The journey through the storm was nightmarish, but they made it. Constance was installed in a warm bedroom, attended by Dr. Porter and Mrs. Appleby. Oliver was given hot food and dry clothes. Mrs. Davies was shown to the servants' quarters, and Eleanor stood in the entrance hall of Northmere Hall, dripping melted snow onto marble floors, watching Julian give quiet orders to his staff. He was still in his snow-covered coat, his hair wet, his hands showing the faint scars from where he'd broken through the ice weeks ago. When the hall finally emptied, leaving them alone, Julian turned to face her. "Your mother will be fine," he said. His voice was carefully neutral. "She needs warmth and rest. But Dr. Porter says there's no permanent damage." "Thank you," Eleanor managed, "for coming, for helping, for—" "Don't." The word was sharp. "Don't thank me as though I'm a stranger performing a courtesy. You're not some random neighbor in need, Eleanor. You're—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "You're the woman I love. Even when you push me away, even when you throw my help back in my face, I will always come when you need me. But I can't keep doing this dance where you accept my aid and reject my heart." "I know," Eleanor's voice broke. "Julian, I know. And I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for everything. For my pride, for my fear, for hurting you when you've been nothing but good to me. I was wrong, about all of it." He studied her face for a long moment. "What changed?" "Everything. Nothing. I don't know." Eleanor took a shaking breath. "I nearly lost my mother tonight because I was too proud to accept your help months ago. Oliver could have died trying to reach you. And all I could think while I waited was that if I had one more chance, I would tell you the truth, that I love you, that I want to marry you, that I'm terrified of what that means. But I'm more terrified of living without you." Julian closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them again, something in his expression had softened. "Say it again. I love you. I want to marry you, if you'll still have me." He crossed the distance between them in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. Eleanor buried her face in his snow-damp coat and held on as though she would never let go. "I'll have you," he said against her hair, "on one condition. No more pride, no more pushing me away. We face everything together from now on, as equals." "As equals," Eleanor agreed, and for the first time in months, she felt the weight lift from her shoulders. She wasn't surrendering. She was choosing partnership, choosing love, choosing to finally let herself be saved, knowing it didn't make her weak. It just made her human. The storm lasted 5 days, trapping them all at Northmere Hall, while snow piled against the windows and wind rattled the shutters. Eleanor had expected the forced proximity to be awkward, but instead, it felt like a gift. Time suspended. The outside world unable to intrude. Constance recovered slowly in her warm room, her colour returning as proper meals and excellent care worked their magic. Dr. Porter visited daily, pronouncing her condition stable but insisting on continued rest. Mrs. Appleby fussed over her like a mother hen, bringing broth and fresh linens and gentle conversation. Oliver thrived. The guilt that had haunted him since the skating accident began to fade as Julian spent hours with him, talking about everything from philosophy to horsemanship. On the 3rd day of the storm, Eleanor found them in the library, Julian teaching Oliver about estate management while snow fell silently beyond the windows. "Your sister has excellent instincts," Julian was saying, pointing to a ledger. "But there are techniques for forecasting income that would make planning easier. Look here, at the 3-year averages." Oliver glanced up and saw Eleanor in the doorway. His smile was the first genuine one she'd seen in weeks. "Eleanor, did you know you can predict crop yields by tracking weather patterns? Julian's been showing me his system." "I did not know that," Eleanor said, warmth spreading through her chest. This, she thought, this was what partnership looked like. Not one person solving all the problems, but people sharing knowledge, lifting each other up. Julian looked at her, and the expression in his eyes made her breath catch. Love, yes, but also respect. pride, partnership, everything she had been too frightened to accept. The evenings were the best part. With the storm raging outside, the household gathered in the drawing room. Julian read aloud from books in his extensive library. Oliver played chess with Thomas while Eleanor worked on mending. Constance dozed by the fire, looking more peaceful than she had in years. Even Mrs. Appleby and Mrs. Davies joined them sometimes, the formal boundaries between master and servants softening in the isolated intimacy. On the fourth night, when Oliver and the servants had retired and Constance was sleeping upstairs, Eleanor and Julian sat alone in the library. The fire burned low. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken. "I need to tell you something," Julian said quietly, "about my first marriage, about why I stayed away from Yorkshire for so long." Eleanor set aside her book and waited. "Her name was Catherine," Julian continued. "The marriage was arranged by our families when we were barely out of childhood. We barely knew each other when we wed. She was 18. I was 29. She wanted love and romance, and I—" He paused, his hands tightening on the arms of his chair. "I gave her courtesy and distance. I thought that was what marriage was supposed to be. Polite, respectful, separate. Julian, you don't have to—" "I do, because you need to understand why I reacted so strongly when you accused me of solving your problems. Why it hurt so much." He looked at her directly. "Catherine died 6 months after our wedding. A fever that should have been manageable. But she had no will to fight it. The doctor said it was as though she simply let go. And I've spent 5 years wondering if my coldness killed her. If she died because I made her so lonely that living wasn't worth the effort." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "That's not your fault. You can't blame yourself for—" "Can't I? I gave her everything except what she actually needed. I solved all her material problems and ignored her emotional ones. So when you said I was treating you like another problem to solve, it struck at my deepest fear. That I was making the same mistake again. That I was offering you everything except what you truly needed. Which is what?" Eleanor asked softly. "A choice. Agency. Partnership. Not rescue, but companionship." Julian rose and crossed to where she sat. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his. "I don't want to save you, Eleanor. I want to build a life with you. There's a difference." "I know that now," Eleanor said. "I was wrong to suggest otherwise. You've never made me feel diminished. I did that to myself with my own fear and pride." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Julian said, "Thomas told me something interesting. About the day after the skating party, when the gossip started. Do you know where the rumours came from? The ones about you engineering the accident to trap me?" Eleanor shook her head. "Lady Harriet. She apparently told half of London that you had deliberately ventured onto thin ice to force my hand. She embellished the story considerably. Made it sound as though you had plotted the entire thing." Julian's voice hardened. Thomas confronted her. Publicly, at a gathering 2 weeks ago. He presented evidence that the ice had been marked as dangerous, but the markers had been removed by vandals the night before the party. He made it clear that the accident was exactly that, an accident. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because the gossip had already spread too far. Thomas did his best, but once a reputation is damaged— Julian squeezed her hands. "Lady Harriet has left Yorkshire. She won't be spreading any more lies. And over time, when people see us together, happy, the gossip will die. It always does." "Together," Eleanor repeated. "You're certain, even knowing the scandal it will cause? Your family will object. Your peers will question your judgment. Are you truly willing to face that for me?" "I would face far worse for you," Julian said simply. "I don't care what society thinks. I care about you, about the life we can build together, about waking up every morning beside someone who sees me, truly sees me, not the title or the fortune. That's worth any amount of gossip." Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him. It was soft and sweet and full of promise. "When did you become such a romantic?" "The moment I met a woman with ink-stained fingers and account ledgers who showed me what true strength looked like. The next morning dawned clear and bright. The storm had passed, leaving the world buried under feet of pristine snow. Oliver was the first to venture out, whooping with delight as he sank to his knees in the drifts. Julian organized a crew to begin clearing paths, and Eleanor found herself laughing as she watched dignified footmen engage in an impromptu snowball fight. But beneath the levity, there were practical matters to address. Fairmont Manor would need significant repairs. The roof required complete reconstruction. Other damage from the storm needed assessment. It would take months of work and considerable expense. That afternoon, Eleanor and Julian sat down with the estate ledgers in his study. "I've already contacted builders," Julian said. "They'll assess the damage when the road's clear. But Eleanor, this is your decision. We can repair Fairmont Manor and maintain it as a separate property. Or," he paused, "or we can consider it part of the larger Northmere Holdings. Consolidate the management. Use it however you see fit." "You're asking if I want to keep my independence or accept integration," Eleanor said. "I'm asking what would make you happy. There's no wrong answer." Eleanor thought about it. The old Eleanor would have fought to maintain Fairmont Manor separately, would have insisted on managing it alone as proof of her capability. But that Eleanor had been operating from fear, from the need to prove something. "Fairmont Manor has been a burden for 3 years," she said slowly. "A beloved burden, but a burden nonetheless. I think I'm ready to let it be something else. Not mine alone, but ours together. A country house for when we want quiet. A place for Oliver to bring his Oxford friends. A home, but not a fortress I have to defend alone anymore." Julian smiled, and the relief in his expression told Eleanor she had made the right choice. That evening, as they gathered once more in the drawing room, Constance asked to speak with them. She sat by the fire, looking stronger than she had in months, her eyes bright. "I want to be very clear about something," she said. "I'm not dying. Dr. Porter assures me that with proper care, I have many good years left. But I am also not blind. I see what's growing between you two, and I want you to know that you have my complete blessing." "Mama," Eleanor began, but Constance raised her hand. "Let me finish. Eleanor, you've spent 3 years sacrificing for me and for Oliver. You've put your life on hold out of duty and love. But the greatest gift you can give me now is your happiness. Marry the Duke. Build a life with him. Let me spend my remaining years watching you thrive instead of merely survive." Eleanor crossed to her mother and embraced her carefully. "I love you. I love you too, my darling girl. And I'm so proud of you. Not for enduring, but for learning when to accept help. That takes more courage than enduring alone ever could." That night, Eleanor stood at the window of her bedroom at Northmere Hall, watching moonlight on snow. Behind her, the door opened softly. "I'm sorry," Julian said. "I should have knocked. I just wanted to make sure you had everything you needed before." "Stay," Eleanor said, turning to face him. "Just for a moment. I need to say something." He moved into the room but left the door open, propriety maintained even in the privacy of night. "I've been thinking about what you said," Eleanor continued, "about choices, about partnership, and I realized something. The reason I fought so hard against accepting your help wasn't really about pride or independence. It was because I didn't think I deserved it. I didn't think I deserved to be happy. Eleanor, 3 years of struggle convinced me that suffering was my lot, that I had to earn every small joy through pain and sacrifice. But you've shown me something different. You've shown me that love doesn't have to be earned, that partnership isn't weakness, that accepting help isn't failure. It's just human. And now," Julian asked softly, "now I choose happiness. I choose partnership. I choose you." Eleanor held out her hand. "If the offer still stands." Julian crossed the room and took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "The offer will always stand. For as long as you want it. Then I suppose we should plan a wedding." His smile was brighter than the moonlight. "I suppose we should." Outside, the world was still buried in snow, but inside Northmere Hall, warmed by fire and by love, spring had already begun to bloom. They married in the chapel at Northmere Hall on a clear morning in late March. when the first hints of spring were beginning to soften the Yorkshire landscape. Snow still lingered in shadowed corners, but crocuses had begun pushing through the earth, and the air carried a promise of warmth to come. The ceremony was small. Family and friends only, Julian had insisted, though Eleanor suspected his definition of friends was considerably more generous than hers. Thomas Bennet stood as witness, his kind face beaming. Mrs. Appleby and Mrs. Davies wept openly in their pews. Dr. Porter attended with his wife, their presence a reminder of how much had changed since those desperate days of winter. Constance sat in the front row, looking stronger than she had in years. The months of proper care, warm rooms, and excellent food had worked a transformation. Her colour was good, her breathing easy, her smile radiant as she watched her daughter marry a man who loved her. Oliver stood beside Julian, having been asked to serve in lieu of the Duke's London relatives, who had expressed varying degrees of disapproval about the match. Let them disapprove, Julian had said. Oliver was more family than any of them had ever been. Eleanor wore a dress of cream silk, simple but beautifully made. No borrowed clothing this time. Julian had insisted on commissioning a trousseau, and Eleanor had learned to accept such gifts with grace rather than guilt. Her hair was arranged simply, a few spring flowers woven through the curls. When she walked down the short aisle and saw Julian waiting for her, his expression openly adoring, Eleanor felt any lingering doubts dissolve. This was right. This was real. This was love chosen freely by two people who saw each other clearly and loved what they saw. The vows were traditional, but Eleanor heard the weight in Julian's voice when he promised to honour and cherish her, heard the way his voice caught slightly when he said, "Till death do us part," and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, when Julian kissed her with such tenderness that several guests sighed audibly. Eleanor felt something fundamental shift in her understanding of herself. She was no longer alone. And that wasn't weakness. It was strength multiplied. The wedding breakfast was held in Northmere Hall's dining room, sunlight streaming through tall windows. The food was excellent, the company warm, the conversation flowing easily. Eleanor sat beside Julian and marvelled at how natural it felt. How right. "Are you happy?" Julian murmured during a lull in conversation. "Deliriously," Eleanor replied. "Are you?" "More than I knew how to hope for." He lifted her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Though I suspect the difficult part is just beginning." "What do you mean?" "Convincing Yorkshire society that you're not a scheming fortune hunter. Convincing my London relatives that I haven't lost my mind. Navigating the politics of being a duchess." Julian's smile was wry. "Marriage is the easy part. It's the rest of the world that will be complicated. Then it's fortunate we're facing it together." The county's response to their marriage was mixed, as Julian had predicted. Some families, those who had known the Fairmonts before the scandal, offered genuine congratulations. Others were more reserved, their courtesy cold and their judgment evident. Visconde Hartley, mercifully, had removed himself to London and showed no signs of returning, but Eleanor found she cared less about society's opinion than she had expected. She had Julian's respect and love. She had her family's happiness. She had purpose and partnership. The whispers of small-minded people felt increasingly irrelevant. 3 weeks after the wedding, Oliver departed for Oxford. Julian had secured his admission through a combination of influence and Oliver's own considerable intellect. The boy was nervous but glowing with excitement as he said his farewells. "Thank you," he said to Julian, shaking his hand with the earnest formality of 16. "For everything. For believing in me when no one else did." "I didn't have to believe in you," Julian replied. "Your sister already did. I just provided the opportunity. What you do with it is entirely up to you." Oliver turned to Eleanor and hugged her tightly. "I'll make you proud," he whispered. "I promise." "You already have," Eleanor assured him. "Just by being yourself. Now go learn things and have adventures and write to me every week." "Every week," he promised, and then he was gone, disappearing into the carriage that would carry him toward his future. Eleanor stood beside Julian on the front steps of Northmere Hall and waved until the carriage vanished from sight. When it was gone, she felt Julian's arm come around her waist. He'll be fine, Julian said quietly. Better than fine. He'll thrive. I know. It's just strange. For 3 years, he's been my responsibility, my reason for enduring. And now you get to live for yourself, for us. That's not selfish, Eleanor. That's healthy. Fairmont Manor's restoration was completed by early summer. The roof had been entirely rebuilt, the structure reinforced, the interiors refreshed. It was no longer a burden slowly crumbling under the weight of neglect. It was a proper country house, comfortable and charming. What do you want to do with it? Julian asked as they walked through the restored rooms. Eleanor considered. I think it should be Oliver's. When he finishes Oxford, when he's ready to establish himself, he'll need a home, somewhere that's his, that carries our family history. Would you mind? It's your property, your decision. It's our property now. That was the agreement. Partnership. Julian smiled and pulled her close. Then I think giving it to Oliver is perfect. A legacy that isn't about debt and failure, but about love and possibility. Your father would have liked that. I think he would have. They made Northmere Hall their primary residence, and Eleanor discovered she loved the rhythm of life as a duchess. Not the social obligations, which she tolerated with Julian's amused support, but the practical work of managing a large estate. Julian valued her opinions, sought her input, treated her as a true partner in decisions large and small. In the quiet weeks after their wedding, Eleanor at last replied to Mr. Dalton McGregor's letter. Her refusal was brief but sincere, thanking him for the dignity of his proposal while explaining that her life and heart were now firmly rooted in Yorkshire. Sealing the envelope in Julian's study with his steady presence at her shoulder, she felt the final, desperate escape route she had once considered close behind her, leaving only the future she had chosen. Together, they reviewed accounts, planned improvements, discussed investments. Eleanor's years of managing Fairmont Manor on nothing had taught her efficiency and creativity. Julian's resources and experience provided scope and possibility. The combination was powerful. Constance moved into a suite of rooms in Northmere Hall's south wing, with large windows overlooking the gardens and a sitting room where she could receive visitors. Her health continued to improve, and she spent her days reading, writing letters to Oliver, and occasionally hosting small gatherings of local ladies who seemed genuinely pleased by her company. On a warm afternoon in early June, Eleanor found her mother in the garden, surrounded by early roses. "You look happy," Constance observed. "Truly happy, not just content." "I am." Eleanor sat beside her mother on the stone bench. "Sometimes I wake up and can't quite believe this is my life, that I get to be this happy. You deserve it. You always have. You just needed to believe that yourself." Constance took her daughter's hand. "Your father would be proud of you, you know. Not for marrying a duke, but for learning to accept love without shame. That was something he never managed. I wish he could have known Julian. I think he would have liked him. And I think he would have envied you for finding what he and I had. Love built on respect and partnership." Constance squeezed Eleanor's hand. "That's rarer than you might think, even among people who profess great affection." Summer deepened into autumn. Oliver came home for a visit in September, full of stories about his studies and new friends. He seemed taller, more confident, more himself. He thanked Julian awkwardly for the allowance that had been settled on him, enough to live comfortably without worry. "It's not charity," Julian said firmly. "It's family, and family takes care of each other. That's what it means to belong to something larger than yourself." In October, Eleanor discovered she was with child. The news filled her with equal parts joy and terror. Julian was delighted, immediately becoming overprotective in ways that made Eleanor laugh, even as she reassured him she was perfectly healthy. "I survived falling through ice," she reminded him when he fussed about her walking too far. "I think I can manage pregnancy." "Humour me," he said, tucking a blanket around her knees. "You're carrying the most precious thing in my world." I'm allowed to be cautious. Winter came again, but this time it held no terror. The house was warm, the pantries full, the future secure. Eleanor spent evenings by the fire with Julian, reading or talking or simply existing together in comfortable silence. Sometimes she thought about the woman she had been a year ago, Desperate, proud, determined to survive alone at any cost. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone Eleanor barely recognized. She had learned that strength wasn't about enduring alone. It was about knowing when to reach for the hand being offered, about accepting help without losing yourself, about building something larger and stronger than any one person could create in isolation. On a cold evening in December, Eleanor stood at the window of the library, watching snow fall softly over Northmere Hall's grounds. Behind her, Julian worked at his desk. Constance was upstairs, comfortable and content. Oliver was at Oxford, thriving. The child growing inside Eleanor's body was healthy and strong. "What are you thinking?" Julian asked, joining her at the window. "That I'm grateful," Eleanor said simply. "For all of it. For the storm that forced my hand. For your stubbornness in refusing to let me push you away. For the courage I finally found to accept what you offered." "What did I offer?" "Not rescue. Not charity." Eleanor turned to face him, placing his hand over the gentle swell of her belly. "You offered partnership, love, a future, and I was finally brave enough to say yes." Julian kissed her softly, and outside the snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in peaceful white. Spring would come again. It always did, but winter no longer frightened Eleanor. She had learned that some storms were necessary, that breaking down was sometimes the only way to rebuild stronger, that falling through the ice could be the beginning of something beautiful if you were brave enough to let yourself be saved, and wise enough to recognize that being saved wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning of learning how to save yourself with the help of people who loved you. That was what marriage meant, what partnership meant, what love meant. And Eleanor had finally found the courage to embrace it all. The end.